In this episode, we're going to see how to create posts and subreddit from our Angular application. We will install a cool editor called as TinyMCE in our application, which helps us to write the body of a post. And before starting the video, I recommend to check out the written version of this tutorial, which is the first link in the description section, where you can find out the complete source code of this application, and you can also follow along this tutorial at your own pace. And without any delay, let's start coding. Let's start off by generating the components required to create the subreddits and posts. Inside the terminal, I'm going to type ng-gc subreddit /create subreddit, which stands for ng-generate component with the name create subreddit under the subreddit folder. And after that, I'm going to type ng-gc post create post, which generates the required files for the create post component. In the previous episode, we have already created the buttons for create subreddit and create post inside the sidebar. As we have now created the components, we have to add a route from the create subreddit and create post buttons to these components. Inside the app-routing.module.ts file, let's add two entries with path create post and create subreddits, which point to the respective component. After that, if you go to the sidebar.component.html file, we have defined the value for the click directive as go to create post and go to create subreddit. But we are missing this method definitions inside the sidebar component. So let's go to the component, and here I'm going to implement these two methods. We have the logic to navigate to the create post component inside the go to create post method. And we also have the similar logic inside the go to create subreddit method, where we are navigating to the create subreddit route. Now let's go ahead and implement the logic to create subreddits from our Angular application. I'm going to open the written tutorial and click on the section create subreddit. And I'm going to copy the HTML and CSS code and paste it into the files inside the project. Inside the create subreddit.component.html file, we have a form which contains the form group with value create subreddit form and an ng submit directive which calls the create subreddit method inside the component. Inside this form, we have a div which contains the heading for this form create subreddit. Next, we have an input of type text which holds the title of the subreddit. We declare this field as a form control by using the form control name directive. After that, we have a text area which is another form control which holds the description of the subreddit. Next, we have two buttons, create and discard, and we have an on-click event which is bound to the methods discard and create subreddit for these buttons using the click directive. Now let's go ahead and implement the required form groups, form controls, and methods we need inside the create subreddit.component.ts file. So inside the component, first we declared a form group of variable create subreddit form, which we saw before in the HTML file, and we are initializing this form group inside the constructor with fields title and description. Each of these fields are assigned to a form control object which contains a validator which validates that the value for the fields title and description are not empty. Next, we also declared an initialized subreddit model object. If you remember, we have created this class in the last episode while refactoring the home component. Then we have the create subreddit method, which reads the form control values for fields title and description, and then we are assigning it to the subreddit model object. After constructing the object, we are calling the create subreddit method inside the subreddit service, where we are making a post call to the create subreddit REST API and returning an observable. Inside the component, we are subscribing to this observable response, and when we receive a success response, we are navigating to the list subreddits page. And if we receive an error, we are throwing an error using the throw error method from RxJS. Lastly, we have the discard method, which takes us back to the home page. So here we are navigating to the list subreddits page, but this route and the components do not exist yet. Let's fire up the terminal and create the components by typing ng-gc subreddit/list subreddits to create the components and HTML CSS files. Now again, I'm going to take the help from the written tutorial, and here I'm going to go to the section show all subreddits and copy the HTML and TypeScript code and paste them into the project. So inside the list subreddits.component.html file, we are using an ng for directive to loop through all the subreddits which are stored inside the variable subreddits, and for each subreddit we display the name, and we have an anchor tag which has a router link with the value view subreddit followed by the subreddit name. This route does not exist yet. We will create it soon. And inside the other column to the right side of the page, we have the sidebar component. Now if I go to the list subreddits component, we are calling the getAllSubreddits method of subreddit service inside the ng-oninit of the component. We are subscribing to the response and assigning the response to the subreddits object, which is of type array of subreddit model. If we receive an error response back from the getAllSubreddits call, we throw an error using the throwError method of RxJS. Alright, now let's register the route for /list subreddits to the list subreddits component inside the approuting.module.ts. And after that, if you remember, in our home page, we have a subreddit sidebar component which contains a link to display all the subreddits. Let's go ahead and update that router link value. Now let's open the application and try to create a subreddit. And as you can see, we are navigated to the list subreddits page, and we can also see the subreddits we have just created. Let's also test whether the navigation is working from the subreddit sidebar. So yes, it's working. Perfect. Our next task is to implement the functionality to create posts. We have already created the components and the supporting source files in the first section of this episode. Before we start our implementation, we need to install some dependencies to our application. To create the posts, we need some kind of editor. So for that, let's use this editor called as TinyMCE with all these fancy controls and options. We can integrate TinyMCE into our Angular project by typing the below command npm install save TinyMCE Angular. This should install and add the TinyMCE Angular dependency in the package.json file. Next, we will enable TinyMCE in our project by adding the editor module to the app.module.ts file. Alright, so before starting the implementation, let's refer our Swagger REST API documentation one more time to see what is the request payload we need to create a post. So here under the post controller, under the create post section, you can see the payload, which takes the fields description, post name, subreddit name, and URL. We can ignore the post ID as this is auto-generated. So let's create these fields inside a class in the Angular project. I'm going to create a new file under the create post folder called as createpost.payload.ts. And inside that, I'm going to create a class which contains the fields post name, subreddit name, URL, and description. Alright, now we need the HTML and CSS code for create post. I'm going to again go to the written tutorial because I don't want to spend time writing the HTML and CSS code. I think there is nothing special in that, so we will just emphasize in the Angular part. So what we have here is in the HTML file is a form tag which contains the form group and ng submit directives. Inside the form tag, we have the create post heading followed by the form control inputs for post name and URL. We also have a drop-down list which contains all the subreddits in our application. We need this because each post should be assigned to a subreddit. And the interesting part here is the editor tag. This I copied from the TinyMCE page. If you go to the documentation, here you can see all the steps required to install the editor in our application, which we have followed before. And lastly, we have the buttons post and discard. So now let's see what's inside the post component. So we have declared and initialized the create post form variable of type form group inside the ng-oninit method. And inside the form group declaration, we define all the fields which our form contains, and we also added the validators to this form control. Next, we are reading all the subreddit information as we have to display them in the dropdown when creating the post. After reading them from the subreddit service, we are assigning the response to a subreddit's variable. Next, we have the create post method, which first reads the form control values and creates the create post payload object. Once we have the necessary data, we call the create post method inside the subreddit service, which is making a HTTP post call to the create post REST API. This method is returning an observable, so we subscribe to the response, and once we receive a success response, we navigate to the home page, or else we throw an error using the throwError method from ngrx library. Lastly, we have a discard post method which redirects us again to the home page. Now let's test our implementation. I'm going to open the home page and click on the create post button on the sidebar section, and I'm going to provide the necessary details here. So you can see the cool TinyMCE editor we installed looks something like this. So I'm going to use this controls and provide some text and click on the post button. And you can see we are navigated to the home page. If you scroll all the way down, you see the HTML code instead of seeing the text in the expected format. This is because the TinyMCE produces HTML code as the output, and we are saving this HTML code inside the DB under the description field. First of all, there is a security risk by storing the raw HTML inside the DB, but we will talk about it later. But for now, we have to change the way we are rendering this information inside the post style component. So let's open up the post style component.html file, and under the div section where we display the description, I'm going to change the interpolation to an inner HTML directive and pass the value post.description to it. This will render our text as HTML, and now we are able to see the text as we expect. In the next episode, we'll try to complete the remaining functionality as much as possible. So I will see you in the next video, and until then, happy coding and stay safe.